What is it about the good old days that are so appealing? Or why do we drift off into a sort of dreamlike state when we remember certain events, certain stages in life? Or why are those share if you remember this, only a few will know, kind of posts on Facebook, why are they so popular? I don't get it really. But the older you get, I have noticed this, the older you get, the more good old days moments there are. And some people will speak forever about the legends past, the people, the stories. I'm sure there's someone in your life, and maybe it's you, who's always telling the same stories from 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 years ago. Same old stories over and over again. Back when I was a kid, or when I was young, or I wish we could turn back time, or in the olden days, and you might have been speaking about 2012, the olden days. Now, personally, I miss the days when you could push someone into a swimming pool and not have to wonder, do they have their phone on them? No, you could just walk right up to them and push them in, no consequences whatsoever, except for the constant fear of walking anywhere near a swimming pool that perhaps one of your friends would choose this moment to chuck you in the pool, and this would be the moment that your day would be ruined, but for the entertainment of everyone else present. So, yeah, not always good. Maybe the good old days weren't so good. Or do we wish like it would be like it used to be? Or do we have that approach to faith, that we wish it would be like it used to be, or to life in general, or to God, that it would be like it used to be? Or what is it that makes the good old days good? Is it nostalgia? Is it innocence? Is it romance? Or are they actually justifiably, quantifiably, measurably better? Well, firstly, we need to understand how our memories work. Our memories are not accurate records of the past. Anne Wilson explains this. She's a professor of psychology, and she says this: we reconstruct what happened in the past on the basis of little bits and pieces of memory. Little bits and pieces of memory. We're acting like archaeologists, picking up the pieces and putting them back together. And then more often than not, when that happens, when we put them back together, well, negative emotions, they fade, and positive memories are enhanced. And this is amplified by our present experience. If life is currently hard or uncomfortable or difficult, well, then we use that as a lens for the way that we look at the past. As an example, with all that we've all experienced in the last couple of years, lockdowns, health risks, fear-mongering, isolation, and so much more, we're inclined to have a form of collective nostalgia about the pre-COVID era, the pre-COVID life. If we start with the assumption that things were better in the past, well, then we're inclined to pull out memories that confirm that hypothesis that we've made. We're also, in general, predisposed to creating a positive sense of ourself and our identity over time. We flatter ourselves via our memories. And now, this is not always true. Definitely not always true. This is generalizations. And trauma and pain can lead us to do the exact opposite of what I've just described. But often what we do is we embellish our memories via our imagination, omitting what we'd rather forget and enhancing what we'd like to remember. The good old days. A 1992 study found that visitors to Disneyland reported significantly more positive recollections of their trips than the details that they reported at the time of their trips themselves, like crying children and endless queues that they spent time in. That's not what they remember years on. So why do I bring all of this up? Well, because the writer of Hebrews is worried about the church. That maybe they're going to drift back into old habits. That maybe they're longing for the old days. That maybe they wish things were like they used to be. And this is not new for God's people. Remember the generation that wandered around in the wilderness after the Exodus? The book of Hebrews, chapters 3 and 4 in particular, they bring that generation up as an example. An example of how it can all go wrong. Having been led by God out of captivity in Egypt, the Israelites, they got a bit grumpy. It was hot. There wasn't enough water, and what water there was a bit bitter. And they were hungry. And when they did get fed, well, there wasn't any meat. And Moses took too long on the mountain. He's been up there too long. They don't like his leadership. And their enemies, well, they're too scary. And repeatedly, they longed for the good old days. The good old days back in Egypt. Remember them? Captivity, slavery, oppression, the good old days. Now, from an outside perspective, I don't think the good old days were that good. And for the preacher of Hebrews, he looks at the church and he feels like it could happen all over again. Why can that happen? Why might they long for the past? Well, let's take a moment to think about what their present was like. As we've discussed in previous weeks, we don't know the exact details, but we know the church was under pressure. Now have a look at chapter 10 with me. We're going to read in a few weeks' time. It says, "Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. And sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions." They had endured persecution themselves, and they'd stood alongside others who were being oppressed through conflict and suffering, public shame, property being taken, even imprisonment. And their current circumstances became the lens through which they looked at the past. And so they're looking around at each other going, well, wasn't it better before this? Wasn't it easier before we took a stand in following Jesus? Wasn't it easier? Wasn't life easier? Should we go back? Should we go back to the good old days? Should we go back to our old ways? And so now they're in danger. As we've seen over the last few weeks, there's been a few warnings. Now they're in danger of drift, of disobedience, of deafness to God's voice, indifference to his call. Old habits of sin, old practices of sacrifice, old beliefs about salvation. What are our old habits, our old practices, our old beliefs? Old habits like gossiping or speaking behind others' backs, putting yourself first, putting others down. Old habits like craving possessions or popularity or prosperity or pleasure. Old practices like trying to earn God's love. Old practices like simply going through the motions. Empty rituals, vain repetitions. Old beliefs we held. Old beliefs like following the trends of culture, of worshipping the idols of our time, of trusting in the ways of this world. What are our old habits, our old practices, our old beliefs? Whatever our old ways are, they don't work. They don't work, but there is an answer. There are plenty of times when the book of Hebrews is completely unclear. There's some mystery and unknown. This is not one of them. This is not one of them. Chapter 8, verse 1 that Abby read for us. Now the main point of what we are saying is this. Could he have made it any clearer at this point? The main point of what we are saying is this. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. We're summarizing all of chapters 1 to 7 that we've looked at so far, and in particular, what's just been said in chapter 7. In Jesus, we have a better high priest. Better than the descendants of Aaron, better than the tribe of Levi, better than the somewhat enigmatic character of Melchizedek. Better. As Duncan spoke about last week, in Jesus we have the perfect union of priest and king. He brings those two things together, fulfilling the words of Psalm 110 that are so key to the entire argument of Hebrews. Jesus is a perfect priest, a perfect king, and he's an eternal priest, an eternal king. And his work of salvation is completed, which we're going to see more in the next two chapters, in chapters 9 and 10. And he sits enthroned in heaven. That's Hebrews chapter 1 to 7, all in a nutshell there. And now the writer introduces a new theme, verse 2. Jesus who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. This exalted king, this exalted and eternal high priest is the minister, is the servant of the true dwelling place of God. The temple, the sanctuary, the tabernacle. Now, this is the main point of the argument for why the old ways don't work. What this church was trying to do or tempted to do, it wasn't going to work. And the author explains why in two ways. Firstly, it's the earthly sanctuary versus the heavenly sanctuary. Secondly, the first covenant versus the new covenant. So firstly, the sanctuary. Jesus, we're told, serves in the true tabernacle. The true tabernacle. But to get an idea of what that is, well, Hebrews 8 explains what's wrong with the not true tabernacle. Verse 3, every high priest is appointed by God to offer both gifts and sacrifices. That's summing up the whole sacrificial system. And so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. For Jesus to also offer a sacrifice. Verse 4 sets up what is called a conditional clause. The one that's contrary to fact. Now it sounds a bit technical, but it's an if statement. An if statement that is opposite to the truth. It says, if he were on earth, which he isn't. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. The temple priests, they've already got a job. They have that job and they're doing it already. And so Jesus offers something different, something better. And then verse 5, they, the earthly priests, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. And Moses was given a pattern. This was quoted from Exodus 25:40. And that was an instruction, a vision, perhaps even a model of what the tabernacle should be. But it was only ever a copy of the true tabernacle. Only a shadow, temporary and transitory. It was never the real thing, never the real thing. Not real in contrast to fake though, but real as contrasted with permanent and perfect. It was never permanent and perfect. Well, in the incredibly quotable and also incredibly ridiculous movie Zoolander, Ben Stiller's character, his character Derek, is presented with his dream project, the Center for Kids Who Can't Read Good. And after the unveiling, Derek is silent. He looks upset. Isn't this what he wanted? Isn't this what he wanted? And then the famous quote, and I know it's one of Duncan's favorites. What is this? A center for ants? It needs to be at least 3 times bigger. 3 times bigger. And he throws the architect's model onto the floor. Derek, who isn't incredibly bright in the movie, he mistook the copy for the real thing. The temple was always only a model of the real thing, a shadow of what is true. The real thing needs to be at least 3 times bigger. So how foolish to go back to the copy, to go back to the shadow instead of what is true. And so what is that true tabernacle? From verse 2, and it comes up again in chapter 9 and verse 11. What is that true tabernacle? Well, option one is Jesus' glorified body, the true tabernacle. It's borrowing language from John's gospel. In that, Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And then John notes he was speaking about the temple of his body. Now, this is not necessarily wrong, but it doesn't fit the context here in Hebrews. So option 2, well, Jesus' body, not his physical body, but Jesus' body, the church. And chapter 9 talks about Jesus entering through the tabernacle. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for it to be the church. That doesn't fit very well either here. So what's option 3? Option 3 is heaven. And not heaven in a sense of a place to go after you die, but heaven as in the dwelling place of God, a place of worship around his throne. Now, this option makes the best sense of the contrast with the earthly temple, an earthly tabernacle and a heavenly tabernacle. This doesn't make the temple in Jerusalem a fake temple. It was true in its own time, but through Jesus we are shown what is eternal, what is perfect. And so the writer of Hebrews says, so to go back now to what was only ever temporary, well, that would be false, because it has been fulfilled. It's been replaced by the heavenly reality. It's kind of the opposite of the story of the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy sees behind the curtain of the wizard, and the reality. This is a spoiler, but if you don't know the story right now, yeah. Anyway, Dorothy sees behind the curtain of the wizard, and the reality is not a king, but just a puppet. And in Hebrews, we see behind the curtain of the temple, and we see the reality of a glorious heavenly temple, not a puppet behind there, where we see Jesus, who is the perfect and eternal priest and king. And so we're told in verse 6, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is the mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. Better promises. Going back to the old ways, it won't work. The old ways won't work. Because the earthly sanctuary and its priests is a shadow of the true ministry of Jesus. And also because the old covenant is a shadow of the new one. For, we read in verse 7, if there had been nothing wrong, again, this is like verse 4, this is a contrary to fact clause. If there had been nothing wrong, but there was something wrong. If there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, well, then no place would have been sought for another. There was something wrong. There was something wrong with the old way, with the old covenant. Now, this idea of covenant, it's a contract or it's a treaty that binds two sides to one another. But repeatedly we read in our Bibles that covenant is broken. How? How is it broken? Well, verse 8 explains it for us. But God found fault with the people and said what? Well, now, like we so often do, the preacher of Hebrews, he picks up an Old Testament passage and sheds new light on it. And here he picks up the words of the prophet Jeremiah, or more correctly, the words of God. It says, the days are coming, declares the Lord. The last days. The days are coming, the last days, taking us back to chapter 1 of Hebrews. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. The days are coming. In Jeremiah, those last days, they're a time of restoration, where judgment is reversed. And you can read about that in Jeremiah chapters 30 to 33. It goes on to say, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. And here's the kicker. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors, when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. The old ways didn't work, but the fault wasn't with the covenant, with the people. They rejected the covenant. Elsewhere in Jeremiah, God says that his people followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. My people do not know me. They are skilled in doing evil. They don't know how to do good. These are harsh words. But time and time again, we see the Israelites turn away from God. They love to do their own thing. And time again, God pursues them. Finally, something gives. We read, they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them. God turns his back. They broke the relationship, and God turns his back on their unfaithfulness. Sadly, we're all too used to unfaithfulness in relationships. Fractured families, bitter friendships, split marriages, gossip and lies, cheating and deceit, two-faced, broken promises. We know that in our relationships with one another. And we know that with God. We're no better than the Israelites of Jeremiah's days. We do not remain faithful. So God turns away. But that's not the end of the story, is it? The answer to unfaithfulness is not better faithfulness on our part, not better practices on our part, not better rituals or better sacrifices. God's response to faithlessness is better promises. Better promises. And so what are those better promises? The writer of Hebrews unpacks them from Jeremiah 31. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds. I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. God will be their God, and they will be his people. God will be their God, and they will be his people in a way they have never been. 3 new ways in particular. The first one, the law in their minds, the law written on their hearts. God's commands are no longer tablets of stone that were met with hearts of stone. God renews our minds, transforms our hearts. The cross is the death of our old minds, of our old hearts. The resurrection breathes new life, and we're filled with the Spirit. Obedience is made possible. Faithfulness is possible as it proceeds from a changed heart. The second better promise, they will all know God from the least to the greatest. The all is God's people. All God's people will know him, and it comes without any distinction, any discrimination, from the least to the greatest. No earthly priests or kings, no go-betweens. We will have a personal, intimate relationship with God. Not trivial knowledge or rehearsed facts. No, it's real. It's experiential. In Jesus, we meet God face to face, and he walks with us. He dwells in us by his Spirit. The third better promise, wickedness forgiven, sins remembered no more. This third promise is that of full forgiveness, of guilt removed, of shame erased. Jesus' death provides a once-for-all sacrifice that does away with the old system. The old system is gone. There's an incredible freedom in full forgiveness. And I'm so looking forward to Glenn sharing about that next week as we look at Hebrews 9. Don't miss it, because Hebrews chapter 9 is a liberating word for each one of us. Full forgiveness, freedom from sin. And we're going to look at some practical implications of these three promises when we break into a few groups in a few minutes. And so I'm going to save that discussion for then. I want to move on to the point of what's the point of quoting these promises from Jeremiah 31. We get to verse 13. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. New replaces old, and there's no going back. So when the world puts your faith under pressure, don't go back. Don't go back to the old way of life. It's not easier. It's not better. And when you're faced with doubts, when you're faced with temptations, don't fall back. Don't fall back into old habits, into the way that you used to live. The old way is dead and buried, and if you follow it, that's where you end up too. The new way is the only way to life. Advertising is constantly trying to sell us this kind of idea. But in marketing, it's new for old when old is still more than functional. More than functional, it's just not fashionable anymore. When a new iPhone comes along, they try and convince you that it makes the old one obsolete, even though 12 months ago they told you that it was the best thing ever. The old one is now obsolete, that you need to upgrade. You have to upgrade. The new covenant is not an upgrade. It's a replacement, and there's nothing new to now come after it. And there's a warning for a culture like ours that worships progression and obsesses over what's new. There is no New Covenant Plus or New Covenant Pro or New Covenant Pro Max, whatever we might come up with. There's no new gospel. Whatever new teaching or ideas or heresies, what we already have is better. Jesus changes our stone-dead hearts. He reconciles our broken relationship with God. He erases our burden of guilt. And this he has done. He's done it for us. So don't fall back into old ways. And don't try and create something new. Trust in what Jesus has done. And rest in what Jesus has done. Let's pray. Father, we thank you. We thank you for what you have done. That Jesus has made a better way. And so, Lord, help us to hold on to that. Do not drift back into old habits, old practices, old beliefs. And also to not look for something new. Because what you have done is better. So Lord, help us to trust in that. Trust in the way that you change our hearts. Trust in the way that you restore our relationship with God. Trust in the way that you erase our sin and guilt and shame. And Lord, would we rest in that? That we would live lives that bring you glory because we trust in you and we rest in you. You're good and faithful and your promises are true. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.